10 inventions created before civilization. Almost 500,000 years ago, someone cut a deep notch into a tree trunk and fitted another log across it. There were no cities, no writing, and no Homo sapiens. Yet this was already engineering. Long before civilization, ancient humans had created tools, weapons, clothing, containers, and ways to control fire and food. These are the 10 inventions that formed civilization's hidden foundations, ranked by how deeply they changed the human future. Number 10. Bone to Olels. When bones became technology. At Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, archaeologists uncovered animal bones that did not resemble ordinary remains from a meal. They came mainly from the limbs of large mammals. Across their surfaces were repeated scars where fragments had been deliberately removed. Some had been worked into heavy cutting tools with edges comparable to those seen on stone hand axes. They were approximately 1.5 million years old. Individual bones had been used as tools at even older sites. A broken bone can produce a pointed or sharp edge without requiring much preparation. The evidence from Olduvai revealed something more deliberate. These bones had not simply been picked up because they happened to be useful. Their makers had selected them, struck them repeatedly, and created particular working forms. The pattern pushed systematic bone technology more than 1 million years deeper into the past than archaeologists had previously recognized. Bone behaves differently from stone. It can be lighter, less brittle, and easier to turn into a long point or a smooth working surface. In later periods, people transformed it into awls, needles, spear points, wedges, fishing equipment, and tools for preparing hides. Recognizing the earliest examples is difficult. Predators break bones, geological pressure cracks them. Animals and people trample them into the ground. Humans also smash bones to extract marrow. Each process can produce damage that resembles intentional shaping. Researchers must therefore study the position, direction, and repetition of the marks. One unusual fragment may be ambiguous. An assemblage containing multiple bones modified in similar ways is harder to explain as an accident. That repetition made the Olduvai discovery significant. It suggested a shared method rather than a moment of improvisation. The toolmakers understood that a carcass contained more than food. Skin could provide covering. Tendons could become bindings. Certain bones could be turned into equipment. Selecting the right material was already part of the work. Exactly who performed that work is unknown. Several hominin populations lived in East Africa during this broad period. Without human remains directly associated with every artifact, the maker cannot be named with confidence. The uncertainty does not diminish what the tools reveal. 1.5 million years ago, ancient humans were expanding their technological world. They could recognize useful properties within a material, select suitable pieces, and follow a learned sequence to change them. Bone was no longer waste. It had become technology. Even so, this was not the beginning. Hundreds of thousands of years before those bones were shaped, someone had learned to transform a material capable of preserving the earliest chapters of invention for millions of years. Number 9. Stone to Oles. Before our genus existed, in 2011, an archaeological team working near Lake Turkana in Kenya followed a route they had not originally intended to take. The detour brought them to a dry landscape known as Lomekwi. Embedded in ancient sediments were large stone cores, flakes, and battered objects. They did not resemble the smaller, more familiar Oldowan tools traditionally associated with the earliest members of the genus Homo. The Lomekwi artifacts were heavier. Some appeared to have been struck while resting on an anvil. Others recorded repeated attempts to control the way stone broke under force. Dating placed them at approximately 3.3 million years old. That age overturned a familiar sequence. The tools were roughly 700,000 years older than the earliest widely accepted Oldowan technology. They also predated the oldest known fossils assigned to the genus Homo. Toolmaking could no longer be treated as a behavior that began with our genus. The people responsible may have belonged to an Australopith species or another branch of the human family. No fossil found alongside the tools identifies them. The archaeological context has also been debated. Researchers have questioned whether every object remained in its original position and how the surrounding deposits should be interpreted. Such arguments matter because movement through sediment can separate an artifact from the layer in which it was first left. What Lomekwi made unavoidable was the possibility of a much deeper technological history. The objects record more than random stone breaking. To detach a useful flake, a maker must begin to understand angle, force, and the internal structure of the rock. The core must be positioned. A point of impact must be selected. The strike must be strong enough to remove material without simply crushing everything. The earliest attempts were not refined. That is part of their value. They preserve experimentation. Later, Oldowan toolmakers became more efficient at producing sharp flakes. Acheulean craftspeople shaped large, often symmetrical hand axes. Still later, populations prepared cores so that a flake of planned size and form could be removed with a final blow. Across immense spans of time, people learned to predict stone. A sharp edge opened resources that teeth, fingernails, and unmodified hands could not process efficiently. It could cut hide, separate meat, shape wood, work plants, and break into parts of a carcass that would otherwise remain inaccessible. Stone tools extended the body. They also created a need for teaching. Almost anyone can strike two rocks together. Consistently producing useful edges is different. It requires practice, observation, and adjustment. A skilled maker learns to recognize promising raw material before the first blow is delivered. Those abilities had to pass between individuals. Archaeology cannot recover a lesson given 3 million years ago. It cannot tell us whether spoken language accompanied the demonstration, but recognizable technological traditions persisted across generations, which means knowledge was transmitted rather than continually reinvented from nothing. Stone became a durable record of inherited skill. Its durability also distorts the archaeological picture. Stone survives fire, water, burial, and long periods of erosion. Wood, bark, hide, and fiber usually vanish. The Stone Age appears dominated by stone, partly because stone is what remains. For a long time, almost everything else had to be inferred. Then, two pieces of worked wood emerged from waterlogged ground beside an African waterfall. They showed that ancient humans were not only making tools, they were building. Number 8. Wooden construction. Building before Homo sapiens. Kalambo Falls lies near the border between Zambia and Tanzania, where a river descends toward Lake Tanganyika. The wet ground complicates excavation, but it also created the conditions for an archaeological exception. Waterlogged sediment restricted the oxygen that normally allows buried wood to decay. Within those deposits, researchers found two logs arranged across one another. The upper piece had not been left in its natural form. A broad notch had been deliberately cut into it so that it fitted over the second log. Marks across the wood revealed chopping, scraping, and controlled modification with stone tools. Luminescence dating of the surrounding sediment placed the structure at least 476,000 years ago, with an uncertainty of roughly 23,000 years. It existed long before the earliest known Homo sapiens. No human fossils were recovered beside it. The builder may have belonged to one of several Middle Pleistocene populations living in Africa, but the evidence does not identify which one. Its function remains unresolved as well. The logs may have formed part of a platform raised above wet ground. They could have supported a walkway, a working surface, or the base of a larger structure. Too little survived to reconstruct the complete object. The secure conclusion lies in the joint itself. Someone had altered the shape of one piece of wood so that two separate objects would fit together. That operation required more than a useful strike. A tree had to be selected and cut. The timber had to be transported or repositioned. The notch had to correspond with the second piece. The builder needed to anticipate a relationship that did not yet exist. This was planning on a larger scale than shaping a handheld tool. Kalambo Falls also offers a glimpse of a technological world that has almost entirely disappeared. Wood would have been available across many environments occupied by ancient humans. It could become a digging stick, club, spear, handle, container, frame, sleeping platform, or shelter support. Few of those objects had any chance of surviving for hundreds of thousands of years. The Kalambo structure, therefore, should not be described as the first thing ancient humans ever built. It is the earliest structural use of wood currently preserved and recognized in the archaeological record. Construction may have begun much earlier. The logs also expose the dependence of one technology on another. Stone tools cut the notch. Knowledge of stone made the transformation of wood possible. That pattern would continue. A stone edge became more effective when attached to a wooden handle. A sharp point became a spear. A row of small blades could become part of a larger cutting system. Making those components stay together demanded another innovation. Ancient craftspeople needed a material that did not simply occur in finished form. They had to manufacture it. Number 7. Compost to ou else. The first engineered systems. At several Paleolithic sites, archaeologists found dark residues clinging to stone tools. Chemical analysis identified materials such as natural bitumen, plant resin, and tar produced from bark. These substances had once held stone components against handles made from wood or bone. Some of the earliest manufactured adhesives are associated with Neanderthals in Europe roughly 200,000 years ago. Later, at Middle Stone Age sites in southern Africa, Homo sapiens prepared compound adhesives that could combine plant gum with red ochre. This changed the nature of the object being made. A hand axe can be produced by removing material from a single stone. A composite tool depends on components with different properties. The stone provides a durable cutting edge. Wood or bone adds reach and leverage. Binding keeps the parts aligned. Adhesive stabilizes the joint and helps it withstand force. Each piece alone performs only part of the task. Tar involved a further transformation. Birch bark does not provide a ready-made lump of adhesive. It must be heated so that useful compounds are released and collected as a sticky substance. Researchers once assumed that producing birch tar required a closed structure, careful temperature control, and several highly planned stages. Experimental work later demonstrated that small quantities can also be made through simpler open-air methods. This changed the interpretation without erasing the achievement. Neanderthals understood that heating bark could create a material with properties absent from the original plant. Archaeology cannot determine which manufacturing method was used at every site. The compound adhesives of southern Africa posed a different problem. Plant gum can become brittle or lose its grip under certain conditions. Adding mineral materials such as ochre can alter how the mixture behaves. Yet the proportions matter. Too much additive can weaken the bond. Too little may not produce the intended result. The craftsperson was working with a substance whose quality emerged only after several ingredients had been processed and combined. That demanded knowledge of materials collected from different places. Suitable stone might come from one source, wood from another, and resin or mineral additives from somewhere else. Some ingredients were seasonal. Others required transport over considerable distances. The order of work mattered too. A handle might be shaped before the adhesive was heated. Bindings needed to be ready before the mixture cooled. The completed joint could require reheating, adjustment, or later repair. Technology had become a sequence. Composite construction also made tools easier to maintain. When a stone edge broke or became blunt, the damaged piece could be replaced while the handle remained in use. A valuable object no longer had to be discarded because one component failed. The real innovation was not simply a sharper blade. It was the ability to make several materials cooperate as one object. Once a point could be fixed securely to a shaft, the space between a hunter and an animal began to widen. The next invention carried human force beyond the reach of the arm. Number 6. Projectile weapons, hunting beyond arm's reach. Mining operations at Schöningen in northern Germany exposed the remains of an ancient lakeshore. Among animal bones and evidence of repeated human activity, archaeologists recovered a group of wooden hunting weapons. Complete wooden objects from this period are rarely preserved. Here, waterlogged conditions protected shafts that would normally have disappeared. The weapons had been carefully shaped from selected trunks and branches. Their taper, thickness, and balance indicated functional design rather than the casual use of natural sticks. For years, the Schöningen spear horizon was described as approximately 300,000 years old. Research published in 2025 revised its age to around 200,000 years. The new date placed the weapons within a period associated with Neanderthals. It still showed that carefully designed wooden hunting equipment existed long before Homo sapiens established a presence in Europe. How each weapon was used remains open to discussion. Some may have been thrust into animals at close range. Others have proportions consistent with throwing. Experiments using replicas show that carefully balanced wooden spears can travel accurately enough to hit a large target from a practical distance. No experiment can reconstruct an ancient hunt in full. A projectile, nevertheless, changes the problem, confronting the hunter. Approaching a large animal within arm's reach means entering the range of hooves, horns, teeth, and the animal's full body weight. A weapon released from a distance reduces some of that immediate danger. It also creates new possibilities for cooperation. Hunters can occupy different positions. Some may influence the direction of the animals while others wait near a narrow route. Several weapons can be used against the same target. The precise strategy at Schöningen cannot be recovered. Archaeologists can identify weapons, animal remains, working areas, and patterns of activity. They cannot know every movement made along the lakeshore. The investment in the weapons is easier to see. A suitable tree must be found. The wood has to be cut, shaped, straightened, smoothed, and balanced. The completed shaft must remain strong without becoming too heavy to carry or throw. Later hunting systems added more components. Stone points were attached to shafts. Spear throwers increased leverage. Bows stored energy before releasing much lighter arrows. Determining when those later systems appeared is difficult. Small stone points may have tipped arrows, darts, throwing spears, or handheld weapons. Researchers compare their dimensions, impact fractures, and wear, but the shafts and launching equipment are usually gone. The surviving point does not reveal the entire weapon. Even the wooden spears at Schöningen were part of a larger technological network. Their production relied on stone tools. Some later weapons also required adhesive and binding. Successful use could depend on planning between several people. A hunting weapon was no longer only an object. It was part of an organized activity. One of its least visible components would become useful far beyond hunting. It could connect tools, raise shelters, carry food, make traps, and eventually join the pieces of a garment. It began with fibers twisted together. Number 5. Cordage, the technology that almost disappeared. At Aubry-du-Maras in southeastern France, researchers examined a stone flake once handled by Neanderthals. A fragment only a few millimeters long remained attached to its surface. Under magnification, the fragment revealed a deliberate structure. Plant fibers had first been twisted into separate strands. 3 strands were then combined in the opposite direction, which helped prevent them from unraveling. The object was cordage. It dated between approximately 41,000 and 52,000 years ago and remains the oldest direct evidence of this type of fiber technology. The fibers probably came from the inner bark of a conifer. Collecting suitable material required ecological knowledge. The inner bark changes through the year and can be easier to separate when sap is rising. Processing may involve stripping the bark, beating or soaking it, dividing the fibers, and preparing them for twisting. Only then can the cord be made. Loose fibers pull apart easily. Twisting causes them to grip one another. Combining strands in the opposite direction helps distribute tension and produces a stronger result. A finished cord appears simple because the stages used to create it are hidden. The fragment at Abri Dumaras cannot tell us what the complete object looked like. It may have belonged to a handle, binding, carrying device, net, or another item that decayed. Its importance comes from the larger family of technologies it represents. Cordage can bind a stone point to a shaft. It can hang food beyond the reach of animals. It can become a fishing line, snare carrying net, belt, bag, mat, basket, shelter component, or rope. When cords are knotted, looped, or crossed, they open the way to nets and woven materials. Much of prehistoric daily life may have depended on objects that left almost nothing behind. A stone point can survive in a museum even though the wooden shaft, adhesive, and fiber binding that made it useful have vanished. What remains is not always the invention. Sometimes it is only the most durable component. The cord also challenges older portrayals of Neanderthal technology. Producing a three-ply structure requires the maker to manage several strands at once. Each group must be twisted consistently. Those groups then need to be combined in a way that maintains tension instead of loosening it. That sequence reflects training and repetition. The raw material may also have been collected before it was needed. Suitable fibers had to be recognized, removed, and processed. The work could not necessarily wait until a tool broke or a shelter needed repair. Preparation extended beyond the immediate task. A single fragment cannot reveal how widely the knowledge was shared, and it does not mark the true invention date. Cordage may have existed for far longer than the surviving evidence suggests. That is precisely why the discovery matters. For a brief moment, a technology that normally disappears became visible. Cordage connected tools and structures. When combined with sharpened bone, it could also join separate pieces of animal skin. The result allowed people to carry protection from the climate wherever they went. Number 4. Tailored clothing. Carrying a climate around the body. Almost none of the earliest clothing survives. Animal skin decays. Plant fibers rot. A fragment that does escape destruction may be difficult to distinguish from the remains of a bag, shelter, or binding. The origin of clothing must therefore be reconstructed from indirect clues. Stone scrapers show that ancient humans processed hides. Smooth bone tools could work and soften skin. Awls punctured holes through leather long before needles with eyes became common. The earliest garments were probably uncomplicated. A hide could be wrapped around the shoulders or tied around the body. It offered protection, but loose coverings left gaps through which warmth escaped. Fitted clothing solved a different problem. Pieces could be cut and joined around the torso and limbs. Better seams reduced exposed skin. Layers trapped air and allowed people to remain active in conditions that the unprotected human body could not endure for long. Around 40,000 years ago, eyed needles began appearing at sites across parts of Eurasia. Some of the earliest examples come from Siberia. They were manufactured from bone or ivory, then perforated with a small opening through which sinew or fiber could pass. The eye did not invent clothing. Awls already allowed people to join pieces of hide. A needle made finer and more efficient stitching possible, particularly when garments required tight seams, several layers, or carefully attached decoration. This may record the point at which clothing became something more than protection. Researchers have proposed that eyed needles supported the production of layered outfits and the attachment of beads or other ornaments. As clothing covered more of the body in cold environments, decoration could move from skin onto fabric or hide. Clothing was becoming dress. A pattern of beads or a particular arrangement of materials could communicate identity, affiliation, or status. A person might recognize a member of another group before either of them spoke. Those meanings cannot be reconstructed in detail. Needles demonstrate fine sewing, while ornaments reveal display. They do not preserve every social rule attached to a garment. The practical effect is clearer. Human bodies evolved in relatively warm environments. Clothing reduced the need to wait for biological adaptation. People could manufacture an insulating layer and carry it into a different climate. This widened the range of habitable landscapes. Groups moving into cold parts of Eurasia could remain active for longer periods, protect infants, sleep with less exposure, and survive seasonal temperatures beyond the body's natural comfort. The invention also generated a continuing workload. Hides had to be removed, cleaned, scraped, softened, cut, joined, maintained, and repaired. Sinew or fiber had to be prepared. Needles broke. Garments wore through. A coat represented many hours of skilled labor and access to several different technologies. Stone processed the hide. Bone made the awl or needle. Cordage supplied the thread. Hunting provided the material. The finished garment carried an entire chain of knowledge. Clothing created a controlled environment around the body. The next invention created one around food and water. It emerged among people who were still hunting and gathering, thousands of years before agriculture. Number 3. Pottery. Containers before farming. At Xianrendong Cave in southern China, archaeologists recovered pottery fragments from deposits formed during the last ice age. The vessels were broken, their walls uneven, and their surfaces marked by the way they had been formed. Some fragments carried darkened areas associated with heating. Radiocarbon dating placed the oldest examples between approximately 19,000 and 20,000 years ago. The people using the cave were mobile hunter-gatherers. This challenged an explanation that had long seemed reasonable. Pottery is heavy and breakable. It appears better suited to settled communities than to people who regularly move. Farmers also need containers for water, grain, cooking, and storage. For those reasons, pottery was often treated as a product of agricultural village life. Xianrendong showed that the sequence did not always work that way. In East Asia, hunter-gatherers were making ceramic vessels thousands of years before farming. The question shifted from why farmers needed pots to why mobile foragers considered them worth the effort. Clay vessels could do things baskets and animal skins could not. They held liquid more securely. They tolerated heat. They allowed ingredients to simmer instead of being placed directly in flame. Boiling expanded the range of usable foods. Hard plants could be softened. Small ingredients could be combined. Bones could release grease. Nutrients that might drip away during roasting remained inside the vessel. Scorching on early pottery supports a role in cooking, though it cannot reveal exactly what every pot contained. The vessels may also have served social purposes. Prepared food can be shared, and recognizable forms can acquire meaning within a community. The surviving fragments, however, are too incomplete to support a detailed reconstruction of those customs. The manufacturing process itself was transformative. Clay begins as earth. Water makes it workable. Hands build the walls. Drying removes moisture, but an unfired vessel can still soften or break down when it becomes wet. Heating changes the material permanently. The result no longer returns to mud in the same way. Fire has created a container capable of surviving water and repeated use. Pottery is chemistry preserved in an object. It also shows that technological development did not follow one fixed route. In some places, pottery accompanied agriculture. Elsewhere, it appeared among communities living through hunting, fishing, and gathering. Similar inventions could emerge under different conditions and serve different needs. The early vessels did not immediately create sedentary life, yet ceramic containers would later become essential to communities storing and preparing larger quantities of food. They also became records. Fats could remain absorbed in the walls. Burnt deposits preserve traces of cooking. Microscopic plant remains sometimes survived on surfaces. Long after a meal disappeared, the vessel could retain evidence of it. The earliest pottery at Shanrendong corrected one assumption about agriculture. It also raised a deeper question. Clay can be shaped without flame, but it cannot become durable pottery without controlled heat. The invention of the container depended on an older technology whose origin is divided between two very different abilities. Using fire was one achievement. Creating it was another. Number 2. Fire. From borrowed flame to fire making. Deep inside Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found signs of burning within early Pleistocene deposits. The evidence included heat-altered sediment, stone artifacts affected by temperature, ash in some contexts, and burned animal bones. A study published in 2026 examined small mammal remains from 2 layers. Separate analytical methods confirmed that many of the bones had been exposed to fire rather than merely discolored during fossilization. The older layer dated to somewhere between approximately 1.07 and 1.79 million years ago. When those remains accumulated, the relevant part of the cave lay roughly 30 meters from the entrance. A natural fire burning across the landscape outside could not easily account for repeated, concentrated burning that far inside. The researchers concluded that hominins had carried fire into the cave on several occasions. The users were early Acheulean humans, possibly Homo erectus, although the evidence does not identify a particular species with certainty. Wonderwork provides a strong case for ancient human use of fire. It does not prove those humans knew how to ignite it. For people accustomed to matches or electric sparks, using and making fire can appear to be the same technology. During the earliest stages, they may have been separated by an enormous span of time. Natural flames occur after lightning strikes, wildfires, and volcanic events. A burning branch can be collected, embers can be transported. Fuel can keep a flame alive after the original fire has passed. This would give a group access to warmth, light, and protection, provided the flame did not go out. Reliability remained the difficulty. A community capable of maintaining fire might still have to wait for nature to supply the next one. For many years, the oldest clear evidence of deliberate ignition was far younger than the earliest evidence of fire use. Excavation at Barnum in Suffolk, England, changed that chronology. Researchers identified an area of heated clay associated with flint hand axes damaged by high temperatures. Chemical and magnetic evidence indicated that fire had burned repeatedly in the same location. 2 small pieces of iron pyrite completed the argument. When struck against flint, pyrite can produce sparks capable of igniting tinder. The mineral was extremely rare in the local geology. Its presence suggested that someone had transported it to Barnum because they understood what it could do. The archaeological surface dated to approximately 415,000 years ago. Researchers presented it as the earliest known evidence of humans deliberately making fire, rather than only collecting and maintaining naturally occurring flames. The case rests on context. No trace can preserve the exact moment a person struck pyrite against flint. Instead, several clues converge: a spark-producing mineral brought from elsewhere, intense heat, repeated burning, and tools associated with the heated area. The likely firemakers were early Neanderthals, or a closely related population. Our species was not the only kind of human capable of turning fire into a dependable tool. Once fire could be produced when needed, it changed the limits of human activity. Cold nights became easier to endure. Predators could be discouraged. Light extended useful time beyond sunset. Smoke, heat, and embers could be applied to different materials. Cooking may have been one of the most important consequences. Heating makes many foods softer, safer, and easier to digest. Over long periods, cooked food may have influenced nutrition and human anatomy. Still, a burned bone is not automatically evidence of a meal. Fire could serve warmth, protection, lighting, waste disposal, material processing, or several purposes at once. The oldest evidence must not be forced into a complete domestic scene. Its technological reach is clear enough. Heat can harden wooden points. It can help produce tar. It transforms clay into pottery and changes the properties of pigments. Controlled burning can alter vegetation and influence which plants and animals occupy a landscape. Fire also reorganizes space. A hearth attracts people. Someone must gather fuel. Someone must preserve the flame. Food and work can be brought into the light. Skills can be demonstrated where others can observe them. Archaeology cannot measure every conversation held beside an ancient fire. Repeated burning in particular areas nevertheless suggests that fire became a stable feature of occupied places. The long interval between Wonderwork and Barnum reveals a possible sequence. Collecting natural fire was an opportunity. Keeping it alive was management. Creating it on demand was control. The real history was probably less orderly. Different populations may have gained and lost the knowledge. Earlier evidence may have disappeared. A future excavation could move the date again. For now, the contrast remains striking. Hominins were bringing fire into a cave more than 1 million years ago. The earliest surviving evidence that they could reliably create it is hundreds of thousands of years younger. Fire gave humans access to energy stored in fuel. It allowed them to transform substances their bodies could not alter alone. Yet those communities still depended largely on resources produced by the surrounding ecosystem. The invention ranked first changed that relationship. Humans began influencing which plants grew, which animals reproduced, and how food moved from one season to the next. They started redesigning the living world. Number 1. Agriculture, the invention that remade the world. Near the end of the last ice age, communities in Southwest Asia regularly harvested wild cereals. They returned to productive landscapes, cut plants with stone blades, processed seeds on grinding stones, and carried food back to places occupied for increasingly long periods. At Dra, in the Jordan Valley, people constructed raised storage buildings approximately 11,000 years ago. The structures protected, collected food from moisture and animals. They existed before crops in the region had acquired all the physical traits associated with full domestication. Storage preceded completed farming. That is one reason agriculture cannot be reduced to a date or a single act of invention. No one created a field in one sudden moment. The transformation grew out of repeated interactions between people, plants, animals, climate, and settlement. Gatherers already knew where useful species grew and when they ripened. Some cleared competing vegetation. Seeds could be transported and dispersed near places people expected to revisit. Productive areas received more attention than others. These actions gradually changed the conditions under which plants reproduced. Wild cereal seeds normally separate from the stalk when they mature. Falling allows them to spread without human assistance, but it makes them harder to harvest. Occasionally, a plant carries a mutation that keeps mature seeds attached. In the wild, that can limit natural dispersal. In a harvested field, the same trait becomes useful. People are more likely to collect the attached seeds and later sow some of them. Generation after generation, human behavior alters which plants reproduce. The crop begins to change without anyone needing to understand genetics. Animal domestication followed several different routes. Some species moved closer to settlements because human activity created new food sources. Others were hunted under increasingly controlled conditions. Communities began influencing herd movement, protecting selected animals, and choosing which individuals were killed. Over time, management affected reproduction. Archaeologists reconstruct this process from many kinds of evidence. They examine changes in animal age and sex profiles, body size, horn form, settlement patterns, plant remains, microscopic residues, and ancient DNA. No single clue captures domestication by itself. In Southwest Asia, the transition accelerated roughly 12,000 to 9,000 years ago. Yet this region was not the only center of agricultural invention. Food production systems developed independently in China, New Guinea, Africa, Mesoamerica, South America, and elsewhere. Each followed a different history. Wheat did not become a crop in the same way as rice. Millet followed another route. Maize required its own sequence of selection. Herding goats created different challenges from managing pigs or cattle. There was no universal agricultural package waiting to be discovered. Agriculture was a broad family of inventions linked by a new relationship with living organisms. Hunter-gatherers were never passive occupants of untouched nature. Many used fire, selective harvesting, hunting choices, and the movement of useful species to manage landscapes. Farming intensified and concentrated those practices. Fields placed selected plants together. Herds concentrated selected animals. Water could be redirected. Unwanted vegetation was removed. Burning created preferred habitats. Stored seed carried one season's decisions into the next. The environment was becoming partly designed. That design allowed communities to accumulate food in ways that supported longer residence. If a harvest could be stored, people did not need to leave as soon as local wild resources declined. Houses became worth repairing. Storage buildings became worth defending. Paths, walls, and shared structures acquired longer lives. Population could increase. Larger communities made greater specialization possible. Some individuals could spend more time shaping tools, building structures, exchanging materials, conducting rituals, or organizing stored supplies. The same changes introduced vulnerability. A wild landscape contains many potential foods, each responding differently to weather and disease. A field concentrates fewer species. When one crucial crop fails, many households can be affected at once. Stored food can rot, burn, attract pests, or be stolen. Dense settlements also bring people, waste, and animals into sustained proximity. That allows infectious disease to spread more easily. In some regions, skeletal evidence suggests increased workload, nutritional stress, and declining health during parts of the agricultural transition. Farming did not simply make survival easier. It replaced one collection of risks with another. New ideas about ownership followed the work invested in land and storage. A mobile group may carry possessions, but a field cannot be moved. A granary ties value to a particular place. Stored food can be exchanged, inherited, guarded, taxed, or seized. Control over land, water, livestock, and surplus created opportunities for unequal power. This did not happen everywhere at the same speed. Agricultural villages did not instantly become hierarchical states. Some farming communities remained small or relatively flexible for long periods. The potential scale had nevertheless changed. Sustained food production could support populations far larger than those usually maintained through mobile hunting and gathering. Villages expanded. Trade networks linked distant regions. Labor could be organized for communal construction. Eventually, some settlements became towns and cities. Administrators tracked goods and obligations. Specialists produced objects for people outside their households. Governments, fortifications, monuments, markets, and writing appeared in certain regions. By that point, the foundation was already millions of years old. Farmers harvested with stone edges whose history began before the genus Homo. They shaped wood using tools inherited from far older traditions. Handles were secured with adhesive and cordage. Clothing protected workers through changing seasons. Pottery cooked meals and held supplies. Fire transformed food, clay, wood, and resin. Agriculture gathered earlier inventions into a single expanding system. That is why it stands at number one. It was not the oldest technology or necessarily the most difficult object to manufacture. Its importance came from the number of relationships it changed. Projectile weapons altered the hunt. Clothing altered the climates people could inhabit. Pottery altered cooking and storage. Fire altered energy and materials. Agriculture altered landscapes, population, labor, property, health, conflict, and the organization of time. Daily life became tied to cycles of sowing, growth, harvest, and storage. Work performed in one season might not produce a return until another. Part of the future existed physically as stored seed. Human planning now extended into the reproduction of entire species. Even then, civilization did not appear immediately. Thousands of years separated early cultivation from many of the first cities. Agriculture alone could not create urban life. It could, however, produce and store enough food to support large populations, including people who did not spend every day obtaining their own meals. That capacity made new social structures possible. The first cities were not the beginning of technological history. They were the visible result of inventions accumulated across more than 3 million years. These 10 inventions do not describe a simple march from primitive life toward progress. The first stone toolmakers were not trying to begin civilization. The builders at Kalambo Falls were solving a problem within their own landscape. Neanderthals, twisting plant fibers, could not have imagined cities, writing, or states. Every invention began with an immediate need. Its wider consequences appeared later. Stone tools helped shape wood. Wood became handles and structures. Adhesive and cordage joined independent parts. Projectile weapons turned those materials into coordinated hunting systems. Needles and fiber created fitted clothing. Fire transformed food, resin, pigment, wood, and clay. Pottery and storage changed how resources moved through time. Agriculture connected all of those abilities to a permanent landscape. Civilization rests on accumulated solutions. It also rests on the work of more than one human species. Technology began before the genus Homo. Neanderthals made composite tools, used and created fire, produced hunting weapons, and twisted plant fibers into cordage. Homo sapiens inherited a world in which technological knowledge already had a long history. The archaeological record preserves only part of it. Stone dominates because it endures. Organic materials disappear, forcing researchers to reconstruct once complete objects from isolated points, microscopic residues, cut marks, and rare fragments protected by water or minerals. The oldest surviving example is not necessarily the first example ever made. It is simply the earliest one that escaped destruction, was discovered, correctly identified, and successfully dated. Future excavations may reveal older fire-making, earlier fiber technology, or another wooden structure preserved where decay stopped. Such discoveries will change the dates without changing the larger pattern. Human invention has always been cumulative, shared, and far older than civilization itself. The first cities rose only a few thousand years ago. Beneath them lay technologies developed through more than 3 million years of experimentation, failure, memory, and teaching. Most of the inventors left no names. Many did not belong to our species. Their stone edges, burned bones, notched wood, twisted fibers, and broken vessels are fragments of a much larger inheritance. Somewhere, beneath the ground, another fragment may still be waiting to show that one more foundation of civilization began far earlier than we thought.